Hey, deserving listeners, The Ultimatum. Let's check it out and see what comes out of my face as I watch.
People here, you're not always fucking right. Can you please be open-minded enough that I am telling you the truth? My truth too?
Okay, so to catch you up, Sam and friend and Ozzy were at a restaurant and talking about their relationship. It was a pretty mild introduction into some tension, some issues in their relationship, and Ozzy was triggered very quickly in a very severe manner, which points to some severe trauma. And Ozzy was having a physiological reaction and said, I got to get away. And the friend goes out to comfort Ozzy. And it kind of looked like Sam was emboldened by a friend being there. And the friend was also trying to help, but I don't think the friend really understood the trauma that Ozzy was faced with, that Ozzy has dealt with. The friend went outside and is now being very kind and very helpful to Ozzy, just listening, hand on the back. I'm sure there's a lot of things that the friend could say, like, what? Or you're overreacting or whatever. But the friend understands there are bigger things afoot right now than dealing with this in a super practical way. So the best thing I can do is listen and be there, which is great. And Ozzy is availing themselves of the help and letting it all out. It's not rational, but none of us are when we're triggered. So Ozzy is saying these things. So let's see how things go from here.
I'm accepting your truth. Why can't you accept my truth?
Yeah, and from the look of it, it looks like Ozzy is extremely unreasonable and thus very, very triggered. You can really sense it, right, in the physiological reactivity, right? So, yeah, but it seems like Sam has been dealing with not just someone that gets triggered and stonewalling and distancing, but someone when triggered, and maybe this perspective persists beyond being triggered, that Ozzy feels very justified in thinking like that Sam is being unfair. And it didn't look that way to me. It looked like Sam was just trying to bring something up in a functional way. And so, yeah, I'm guessing there's some sort of transference, some sort of displacement from Ozzy's childhood, but I'm guessing we'll never hear about that, which is fine. I mean, that's not the design of the show, to provide childhood history.
You know where it takes me back to is my fucking childhood. When I would be blamed for everything. And it was not even my fucking fault.
I eat my words. Okay, so yeah, all right. It's always their fault. And and we heard a little bit from the brother, from Ozzy's brother, that mom was very rigid and always knew what was best and didn't listen, didn't allow the kids to talk, didn't allow the kids to voice themselves. So I'm guessing that the way it's being described is a tiny peek into the terror that Ozzy went through as a young person. Maybe even particularly because of Ozzy's queer identity. That could have added to it. But I could also imagine, I think Ozzy is older than the brother. Sometimes older kids can experience more of the abuse, and it spares the younger children a little bit. Not always, of course, but anyway, so Ozzy is saying that, well, let's rewind.
Takes me back to is my fucking childhood. When I would be blamed for everything. And it was not even my fucking fault.
And is that person a therapist? Because when you create space, even if you're like, I don't think this person is rational, then people feel safe enough and they process things enough where they can actually get to more advanced place, which is identifying the childhood trauma. And so for Ozzy, they're saying it was always my fault when it never was. Okay, so that, I'm guessing, there's different versions of that. If you just go off of that description, it's like, well, that's bad, but it's quite possible that what followed the identification that Ozzy was to blame, that there was abuse and absolute rejection. I've heard some pretty horrific stories from clients, obviously. People who seem completely functional and are completely functional in life, but just below the surface is all this. So yeah, I'm guessing it's not just like, hey, it's your fault. It's rejection, maybe physical abuse, ostracization, I hate you, you're worthless, that kind of language. The amount of raw pain and suffering, Mildred included, Aussie, at least on display. We saw some things from Vanessa early in the season. Lexi displays a lot of things, but yeah, just the amount of pain. And yeah, we can't ignore that queer people are oppressed always to some degree, and some to a great degree. It's normal. It's unfortunately common for people, regardless of identity, to be traumatized as children. But queer people are particularly traumatized, not only by the trauma, but also by society and the internalization of the hatred, the self-hatred, the bigotry, and it continues. And boy, does it continue. So it just breaks my heart. And this kind of explains why Aussie is so sure when rejecting Sam of just like, you're imposing on me, and it feels like you're blaming me, right? Because Sam is, not in the way that Aussie's parents blamed, but Sam's like, you're the one that overreacts. Maybe not that language, but that message of you have to figure the things out, or you can't just run away every time. And you can imagine that for Aussie, hearing someone that Aussie very much depends on and is attached to criticizing Aussie, you can imagine Aussie would have that trauma emerge and that terror. And that really, when I was talking in a previous video and observing the visceral reactivity that Aussie was having, that really points to a fundamental terror, an ongoing terror that the young Aussie was going through that encoded itself in the body and the neurology and the reactivity. For some of you, you might have a visceral reaction to snakes or to spiders or to heights. And for some people, that's the same feeling, the same panic, the same utter terror that they feel when a partner is just bringing up something that they're upset about, something that they want you to change. It can really trigger that, and it seems like that's what's happening for Aussie. It just breaks my heart. And you figure with watching the show or doing the show, having a lot of people comment on the show, hopefully there's some grace that Aussie can give to themselves, something that they can say, well, seeing it from the outside, I am now realizing, like, boy, do I have a lot of healing to do. And hearing from a minority of people online, but some people saying that they believe in me and that I'm not a bad person and they commend me. I mean, hopefully that's happening. But I can imagine a world in which these cast members just turn off their comments and don't pay attention because so much of the commentary is so negative and so hurtful and so bullying. And I could see Aussie being bullied, at least by a portion of people, because people just don't understand trauma, or they feel bad for Sam, and that's okay. We can feel bad. That's the magic of being a human being, is we have the ability to feel bad for everybody. We can love everyone. We can give everyone grace. We don't excuse bad behavior, but we can understand where people are coming from and give people the benefit of the doubt. Everyone. We don't have to take sides.
I didn't do shit. I fucking didn't do shit. I fucking didn't do shit. I fucking didn't do.
Yeah. It's you can see it, right? I mean, we might not have ever or will ever see a raw manifestation of one's childhood trauma. I mean, it's obvious. You don't have to be a shrink to see that. Breaks the heart. Oh, it's just tough. We can say that there's some good possibly for Aussie to have a friend listen, to have the space to express and feel okay, to have people support them online, hopefully, to see it from the outside and see, oh, okay, and to hear people say, that's okay, you're okay, that's normal, and begin or continue the road for healing. There's a chance that Aussie has been through 30 years of therapy and is still having these feelings. That's not uncommon. So yeah, this is it could be triggering for y'all. This could be really rough if you have similar traumas. And I'll commend the show for, I mean, I presume, I guess it all depends on Aussie afterwards, how they feel about this being published. I would hope that Aussie was asked, so is it okay? Look at this footage. Is it okay if we put this out there? Because if Aussie is thinking, well, I signed the contract and I had no choice, I didn't even bother saying for them not to publish it, or I did ask them not to and they did it anyway, and there's nothing I can do because I signed away my life when I signed the contract. Like, that would be awful and exploitative and immoral. But maybe Aussie afterwards is like, well, it's not great, but I don't know, that's me, and if that's what I signed up for. So it depends on Aussie. Really depends on that. But yeah, you can see it. You can see the pain, the primal, fundamental childhood pain, the unbridled pain. And the other thing here is, and I was worried about this as well, that for some people with this amount of PTSD, complex PTSD and otherwise, unfortunately, when they're given the space to explore it and to go there, it's just below the surface, the trauma and the reactivity. And a friend is there to listen, and a therapist might be there to listen, that the individual will feel a pull to go there and to talk about it, which is a motivation for health. But if they go too far into it, they can actually re-traumatize themselves because it comes flooding back too quickly. And so for clients, and not a lot of therapists understand this, and I frankly didn't understand it at the beginning of my career. In fact, I had a number of experiences where I made this mistake in my early career. And with one of the clients, actually behind me, you can't see it, it's above the bookshelf there, a client maybe 20 years ago, I was working with her, middle-aged woman who was coming to therapy mainly to talk about parenting and her family relationships, but eventually started getting into her years into it. She sat down on my couch and she said, so I'm now at a place where I feel like I could finally tell you about my childhood. And this is a therapist's dream. This is what one of the main things we're always hoping that'll happen for us, is that we can create a safe place where someone can finally come forward. And she even said, I've never talked about what I'm about to tell you. So I'm celebrating on the inside, and I guess maybe even patting myself in the back and saying like, ooh, you did a good job. And the client, she started talking about her childhood sexual trauma, and I was operating on the model that I was given about helping people with trauma, which was very insufficient. And I listened, and I was caring, and I was careful about what to say, had created space. If there was any kind of question or I intuited I should say something like, that's not your fault, or thank you for telling me, and I feel honored that you're telling me, and I see the pain, and that's awful that someone did that to you, validating being a human being. I thought that was the road to wellness and the road to trauma recovery. And with some clients, it coincided with good treatment, but with some not. And at the end of the session, the client, let out a sigh of relief and said, I'm so glad I told you, and you feel so good, and you're such a good listener, and you're such a great therapist. Thank you so much. And I'm thinking, wow, what a breakthrough. I never saw her again. She terminated the next session, and I never saw her again. And I never knew why, really. I thought, what happened? And I'm sure I must have reached out to her, and I just was always boggled. Again, this was 20 years ago, maybe longer, maybe like 22 years ago. And I still remember it because it was such a stark ending, and I didn't know what happened. And before that, she was a really close client of mine for many years, and I had this Japanese maple in my front yard at the time, and in the fall, all the Japanese little maple red leaves that had fallen on my front lawn, and she had collected a bunch on her way out one day, and she dried them and put them in a frame, and a nice wood frame, and it's behind me. And, my clients have given me various different gifts over the years, but this one I have always carried with me in all of my offices because it reminds me of this, that I didn't know what I was doing. And years later, I figured out through better education and better mentorship and spending time really getting to know clients and really understanding trauma and neurology and understanding PTSD really, because you can understand the symptoms of PTSD, you can understand the notion of trauma and empathy and sort of recovery, but it's a lot of the risk of PTSD recovery is completely out of the control of the client themselves. So in a nutshell, and you can listen to all my episodes on trauma recovery, trauma therapy. I go into detail on this because it's complicated and it's case by case. And the principles that I follow are research-based behavioral therapy, exposure-based, prolonged exposure, other kinds of principles. But it's way deeper than that. Even just understanding exposure and understanding prolonged exposure, or something like EMDR or trauma-focused CBT, or what's the other one, CPT. Understanding those models, even from a clinician point of view, is insufficient to apply it to people, because someone can think that they're ready to share and they've been taught, or they feel like that gravitational pull because they've always wanted to let it out. But what they can do, as I said, is they can re-traumatize themselves because they go too far, they go too fast. And so in a nutshell, eventually we want to get there. In EMDR, they're just imagining it in their mind, they're not saying it out loud. And other forms of evidence-based trauma therapy, like the one I use, they will verbalize it or write it down, or so there's different models. But essentially, the healing and the habituation and the recovery and the reduction of symptoms of PTSD comes from reliving it in your mind, not reliving it in reality, but reliving it in your mind by telling the story. But the key is that the client has to keep their distress level at a 4 or below. It's kind of an arbitrary number, but we'll just go with, at a scale from 1 to 10. And there's no way to avoid it being somewhat distressful, because in order to habituate, in order to recover, you have to experience some of the distress and prolong it over time in an environment where you're safe and you're reassuring yourself, and there are measures in place to actually protect the individual such that the body is able to get used to the memory. So what happens is that people will suddenly go into the memory and they have a lot of distress, which is natural, and there's no measures in place to help them to pace themselves such that they go from 0 to 10, and now they're re-traumatized themselves, and now they have a greater degree of PTSD and of symptomology. So, and a greater reason to avoid talking about it and to think about it. So it takes a tailored therapy experience. So for some people, I will walk them through this process in 10 sessions. It's rare, but for simple PTSD, for simple traumas, then it can take a very short time, and we go through all the steps in that amount of time. And at the end of the treatment, they have 0 PTSD symptoms, and it lasts, in perpetuity. And so, because what we're seeing right now is that visceral, and we've seen it continually with Aussie, I think, is that visceral just panic because of the trauma being triggered. And so, whereas other people, I might work with them for literally 12 years, and they're still in the process of habituating to the stimulus, the trauma memory, the trauma narrative. And there are hundreds of trauma narratives that they have to habituate to. So, meaning that I have to get the person on board with understanding their emotions. They have to be able to know exactly where they are on the scale of distress in the moment. So when I ask them, what number are you? They have to be sufficiently aware of the cues of emotion so that they can answer the question. And that can take a year or two just to develop that. Because when you're traumatized, you cut yourself off for your emotions, you feel ashamed, and it can take a long time. So we establish that before we even talking about the narrative. Then I have to be reassured that they are going to monitor it when they're not in my office, because if we start talking about their narrative, they're going to be triggered outside of therapy, right? I'm not going to be there all the time. So I have to know that they know their distress level all the time. And the average person doesn't know their distress level all the time. So these people have to become superhuman. It's possible, though, with enough practice and therapy. The other thing I have to be reassured is that they can soothe themselves. If they do become a 6 or a 7, they have effective ways that work in the moment in a variety of contexts to actually bring their distress level down. That's hard, right? So that needs to be established. That could take another few years. And again, this is in the midst of a lot of other things they're talking about in therapy, right? It's not like people usually come to therapy with just one issue. They have like 10 issues. So we're interspersing a lot of this work in the therapy. Then I have to be reassured that they can notice their distress level when it's starting to go up, not when it's a 7, but when it's a 3. And they actively have a variety of repertoire of actually bringing their distress level down. And it works effectively, okay? That could take another couple of years. And they do it automatically, meaning that I don't need to encourage them. They buy into the process and they become very good. Again, most people don't know how to do that. Then we can engage in talking about the trauma. So, and then because in the moment, as they're talking about their stories, as they're going to their childhood traumas, I can say, okay, what number are you? And they'll be like, okay, I'm a 5. Okay. Engage in your very robust system of effectively bringing down from a 5. We'll put the narrative for a side to say, bring yourself down, do your effective techniques to bring it down. There's a variety of techniques. And they do that, and they do it outside of therapy as well. And then we return to the narrative, and they go to their childhood, and maybe we talk a little bit. Maybe sometimes we just talk about talking about it. We don't even talk about the trauma. We're like, let's talk about talking about it. And that can bring someone up enough distress, and we can habituate to that. You do that long enough throughout the session. Eventually, the body becomes acclimated, becomes habituated to the thing. This works for phobias. It works for OCD. It works for any kind of terror, fear-based condition. So we do that enough, and eventually we tell all the stories at a 4, not a 5 or a 6 or 7, but at a 4. We keep it there. They become habituated over time, and eventually they can tell the stories and they don't have any distress. And this might take a long time, right? So they have exhausted all the stories that they remember, and they've recalled more and more and more as we've gone down the road. There have been some distress and maybe a little bit of spiking every once in a while, but not too much. So they're not re-traumatizing themselves. And eventually they can tell all the stories and there's zero distress. And thus, along the way as well, there's a lot of meaning involved, a lot of grief, there's a lot of validation and a lot of healing, a lot of corrective experiences between me and the client. And at the end of that, there isn't this. It can take a long time though. And it's hard because the client often doesn't want to do it because no one wants to be a 4. They don't want to be a 4. A 4 is very uncomfortable. Who wants to go to therapy and feel like shit the whole time? You know what I mean? It's no pain, no gain. It really is, and that's the science. So, as a product of this, as a consequence of all this knowledge that I had, when a client will come to me and start, to talk about, so at the beginning of this conversation, Aussie is talking about, hey, it's, and you can sense the trauma that's coming up. And the friend is listening, which you would intuit as being a good idea, right? Now, the individual isn't a specialist, I don't think, or a therapist, so why would they know? But if I were there and I didn't know Aussie well enough, and we didn't have that agreement of understanding distress level and understanding how to soothe the self and understanding the landscape of what'll trigger trauma, then I would stop Aussie and I would say something like, okay, Aussie, I don't want to interrupt you, and I think you're actually talking about some things that are very important to talk about, and I'm glad that you're going there, and I'm glad that you trust me enough to go there. However, I know enough about trauma to know that we have to pace ourselves, and there have to be measures in place before we go into that, into a story that I think you're actually going into. I 1,000,000,000% want to go there, but I don't want to hurt you, and I don't want to push you, and I don't want you to push yourself. So let's take a break here, and because I'm detecting that you actually have severe visceral bodily trauma, and if we don't do a lot of precautions, don't have a lot of precautions in place, then you are going to be harmed. Some of you will possibly, a law of averages, when I talk about all this, you will say, oh my God, that happened to me. I went to therapy, and my therapist just said, tell me about your childhood issues. And I thought, well, okay, I'm supposed to talk about my trauma. I went into it, and it was so dysregulating that for the next 2 months, I was dissociative. I was up and down. I retreated from the world. I was sick. My mental state was completely all over the place. I was suicidal, and I never went back to therapy again. Or I went back to therapy, and the therapist said, well, that's a sign of health. And it's not, typically. Trauma recovery should be paced. It's going to be uncomfortable, but it has to be paced. It'd be akin to if someone was saying, okay, I've never run, I've never jogged, I can barely run, one lap around the track, and I need to be able to run a marathon because I want to be able. And then the first day that you train, you push yourself to run an entire marathon. In all likelihood, your body is going to be harmed by that. There has to be a ramp up to it, right? It's the same principle. Arguably, it's actually a direct analogy to the brain. There's only so much your brain can handle in one sitting. So I think what might have happened, unfortunately, was that the friend was such a good listener that Aussie actually was, pulled into revealing this, and is actually in this moment going way too fast. And maybe the friend is like, okay, let's actually pull this back. Let's see how this goes.
I fucking didn't do shit. I fucking didn't do shit. I fucking didn't do it.
Come here.
I fucking didn't do it. I didn't do it.
Come here.
I'm just trying to be good with it.
I don't know if it's the sentimental music that's manipulating me, but there's also a chance that this was helpful, that this was cathartic. But if I were the friend, especially if I were a therapist to Ozzy, I would have stopped it a while back and said all those things. Again, I would say, I want to go there, believe me, but I've learned enough to know that we have to be careful. So, and what I find is when I do that, clients will thank me. They'll be like, oh my God, thank you. I thought I was supposed to talk about that. And that shows me that you actually understand trauma and trauma recovery. I've never heard anyone say that before. Some of you might have already commented down below along those lines, because it's kind of a rare thing, unfortunately, that therapists would understand this fundamental aspect of trauma. And it's kind of a new-ish concept. But anyway, so I don't know the percentage, and more therapists are aware of all the things I'm saying. So if you're interested in finding a therapist, you might even literally ask, what's your model of trauma recovery? And if they don't give you something along the lines, it doesn't have to be the exact camp of what I'm saying, but the principles have to be there, pacing and making sure that you don't re-traumatize, and there has to be a narrative habituation. If they talk along those lines, then there's a better chance that they know what they're doing and they're not going to hurt you. So that's an unfortunate thing that you have to do, that you have to somehow vet your therapist, which is upsetting. But again, bottom line, it breaks my heart for Aussie. I think Aussie's in their 40s. Can you imagine this entire, presumably Aussie's better now than they were before. Just imagine the pain and the trauma and the hurt and the fear and the terror and the constant sense of danger. And it's just so heartbreaking that people would do that to kids. It's just the worst.
It's just heartache.
I'm trying so hard. I'm trying to be the perfect girlfriend, perfect lover, perfect kid, perfect daughter, perfect co-worker, perfect.
Yeah, so maybe the defense as a child was, if I'm perfect, then it'll mitigate some of the abuse. Not all, of course, but some. And maybe that's the compulsion or the Ozzy strives for and is constantly on that treadmill. So, yeah.
Everything. I'm still not good enough.
Now I'm
Yeah, I just want to tell Ozzy, you are good enough. You're stronger than I am. If I went through what you went through, I would not be as healthy as you are, believe me. And also, there's no amount of willpower that one can use to overcome this. No one can. It's amazing you've survived thus far, that you've actually eked out some happiness and some contentment and some love in the world. So, you're doing a lot better than other people, so good for you. And it's not a matter of willpower. It's not a matter of trying harder. It's a matter of effective, long-term, evidence-based, tailored trauma therapy with someone that knows what they're doing. And that's what will change this for you. Nothing else will change. Literally nothing else. I don't know if I'm reading it right, but if for people with legit PTSD, that is the only answer. There's no medication. There's no yoga retreat. There's no self-help book. There's no YouTube video. Nothing will solve it. Nothing will take away the pain. Nothing will take away the anxiety, the trauma reactivity. Nothing. I'll hold out for the possibility that someone might actually, like for myself, I actually developed a mild case of PTSD with regards to things, and I actually did it to myself, and it worked. So if you don't have to be with a therapist, there is benefits to being with a therapist, obviously, because they know what they're doing. And two, there's a lot of corrective experiences emotionally with someone that cares about you. But you can do this process on your own if you really know what you're doing. So there's that asterisk to it. I don't recommend anyone do that, obviously. But it's like doing surgery on yourself or something. So it can be done, but I don't recommend it. And that can only be done if you're an expert in it yourself, which not a lot of people are anyway. But aside from that, the only road is what I've been talking about. And I say that very confidently. There are different versions of this, whether it's EMDR, or trauma-focused CBT, or cognitive processing therapy. There are other forms, but they're all basically in the same camp of exposure with someone that knows what they're doing.
Bury the pain.
I thought that she would come in, but maybe she just needs that fresh air.
Thank you.
At the end, I feel
And then Sam, is suffering as well. So a lot of the times when I work with people like Aussie, I will bring in their partners and their system, not to treat them, but to tell them, because when we start heading into exposure and habituation, there will be a spike in some symptoms that may make it difficult for partners. And they need to be aware. They need to be in connection with me so that they can problem solve with me, and they can get their own support, obviously. And some people in Sam's shoes aren't willing to go down that road. It's like, I don't want to have to be someone's babysitter. I get it that they have trauma and they deserve to recover, but I don't, I want to move on with my life. I don't have time for this. So, that'll happen sometimes. But, let's acknowledge that Sam is, you could argue that Aussie's parents harmed not only Aussie, but everyone involved with Aussie.
it all. It's just heartache. Tried everything for you to stay, but it was
Well, that does it for that episode. Everyone, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.